Okay, I will just start slowly because it's 1 past the hour. So good afternoon, everyone. It's an afternoon in where I am, and if it is an evening or morning for you, good morning and good evenings. I am delighted to welcome you at today's LIBER webinar. My name is Ilkay Holt. I work as a scholarly communications lead at the British Library in the UK. And I'm a member of LIBER's Open Access Working Group, and this is the reason I have the privilege to welcome you today. So for those who may not be familiar with the organization, the association, LIBER, the Association of European Research Libraries, is the voice of Europe's research library community, and it represents around 420 national, university, and other libraries in Europe and beyond. The topic of this webinar today is towards a transparent transition of open access to the current data landscape. Birgit Schmidt will share the session, and we have two important studies to explore with Bianca Kramer and Najko Jahn today. I would like to say a huge thanks to all presenters for their time and sharing their insights with us. Before I hand over to Birgit to run the session, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes with you, if that's okay. So this webinar is already being recorded and will be shared on LIBER's YouTube channel. The slides will be shared afterwards as well, so you don't need to take notes or something. So the slides will be shared with you, and you'll get a notification on that. We will take the questions after the two talks. When Birgit actually opens the floor for that part, you can put your questions in the meantime and questions in the chat box and the comments in the chat box at any time. And Barbara van der Waard from the LIBER office is supporting us with the Zoom behind the scenes today. I would also like to extend my thanks to her for her support. If you have any technical, difficulties or something, I and herself actually will be looking after the chat and, follow up with your comments and notes in the chat box. I think in terms of practical things, I did cover everything, but please do say or ask, if anything, if I missed, in this part. I now would like to introduce Birgit Schmidt very briefly. Birgit is head of Knowledge Commons at Göttingen State and University Library with a focus on policies, e-infrastructures and training. She serves on the LIBER Executive Board and also currently contributes to other communities at the Research Data Alliance, Knowledge Exchange, among many other groups. So without further ado, Birgit, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ilkay, and also welcome to you all from my side. It's a great pleasure for me to facilitate today's webinar. Only briefly, we all know that the transition to full open access is a long-term effort. For some of you, it might have started 20 years ago, for others 30 years, really depending on your field, your background, your current occupation. And we all know that there has been some constant growth, and we will hear more of this trends and what the status is from Bianca and Najko. And to a certain degree, we certainly have reached a tipping point, but there still is a gap which to overcome takes a lot of work. And for this, we need this effort in terms of transparency, both in terms of what is the status of the shares of open access of various types, but also in terms of the costs and the other efforts which are involved in making this happen. And of course, what are the barriers and monitoring efforts. And we will dig into both the shares, but also what data might inform cost transparency, a little bit perhaps about policies and alternatives around these models. And Najko will dig deeper into a particular area, the so-called transformative or transitional agreements, where you can ask what is the actual share of open access which has been achieved in these journals, which are included in these agreements. And of course, every time you might say, is there differences between countries? Are there differences between disciplines? So without much further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, which will be Bianca Kramer. And then after I hand over to Najko, and after the two presentations, we are very happy to take your questions, but please use the chat to put your comments, your questions while they speak. And Bianca also has a question to the audience, so we will go into this as well. So Bianca, she is independent consultant, research analyst. Before, she has worked about 15 years at Utrecht University as a scholarly communication, open science librarian. She contributed to a number of studies. We also worked together on a study some years ago. And yeah, I leave the introduction to Najko for later. So, but let's hear what Bianca has to say about cost transparency and also open access uptake. And so, take it away.
Thank you, Birgit, and thanks very much for LIBER to organizing this webinar and inviting us for this presentation and discussion, because I hope it will also really be a discussion, an audience discussion afterwards. So when this goes back, you should actually see my full screen. Yes. So yeah, I want to talk today about a study I did for the European Commission, a Commission study, which was titled very broadly, Study on Scientific Publishing in Europe, Development, Diversity and Transparency of Costs. Before going into the different parts of the study, I'd like to briefly mention the background and the reason for doing this. And this was really, the reason for this were the European Council conclusions. I think most of us are aware of the Council conclusion from last year, 2023, where the European Commission really stressed the importance of other business models about non-profit, open infrastructure, and really issued a call to member states and institutions to invest also in those types of publishing and open access. However, there was also a Council conclusion document the year before, 2022, which went deeper into and really made a point, an issue of the cost of scholarly publishing and the transparency around that cost. Transparency around cost billing, how things were paid, and what that does for the proliferation of costs. And that was really the impetus of commissioning this study. So what I tried to do in this study is look at a number of different things. I just want to get my own Zoom things out of the way. Look at a number of different things. Look at national policies and funder policies on open access financing. Look at existing consortium and institutional publisher deals, but also look at other forms of open access financing. Look at available information on open access publication costs, and look at development and diversity of scientific publishing. That's a whole lot. We're not going to cover all of this today. I've also not been able to collect complete information on all of this, but it was a really interesting exercise to see what's actually available and what do we know, and specifically what's available in open data sources. So one thing I'll very briefly touch upon is that first part. How much is actually invested by governments, by funders? Because we mostly looked at that level. And that information is really hard to get. It's really hard to get information on policies regarding open access financing and to get total amounts. And that's not surprising. There are a lot of initiatives over the years that have tried to collect that information. The most recent and most comprehensive, perhaps, is the EOS survey that's also feeding into the dashboard. And just to illustrate, one question that was asked there is what is, from a country, the total investment in open access publishing? And if you map that, you can see that there are some countries that at least report a much higher investment in open access publishing, like Finland and France and Spain, and some others that report a much lower amount. But at the same time, when you look at those data, it becomes really clear that those are incomplete data, that are many different interpretations. How do you estimate the national investment in open access publishing? That can mean very different things to various countries. And because open access is paid for not just by government, not just by national funders, but of course, as we all know, very much also by research institutions, by universities, or by the consortia. So that's a really sticky problem to disentangle. And I hope that in next iterations of this survey in particular, they will start to ask more detailed questions to try and tease that out. And what do we talk about when we talk about open access financing? Of course, we talk about transformative agreements. There's been a lot of attention to that, a lot of efforts towards that, both on a national level, usually by LIBER consortia, and recently also on an international level, where ARFL also started to negotiate transformative agreements on behalf of a number of countries they represent. But of course, there's a lot more than that. Open access financing is also financing full gold journals from full gold, full open access publishers. It also can involve financing or contributing to Subscribe to Open, or financing diamond open access, where no APC is charged. And also it can involve financing non-profit publishing infrastructure. And again, the amounts that go into that, that's really hard to get information from. And I think that's a problem. When we focus on transformative agreements, and the reason for doing this is that we actually have a pretty good data source on that, which is the ESAC registry, where organizations, be that individual institutions or library consortia, can submit their transformative agreements. So it's a registry of transformative agreements. And there's also a small survey attached asking a couple of questions about those agreements. When you dive into those agreements, what I specifically looked at is is the agreement in itself available, and what's in the agreement about total costs and about breakdown of those costs. And what I found really interesting is that there's a big variety in that. On this slide, you just see, has the agreement been fully disclosed and published? Is that agreement available to see and to read? And both within countries and within publishers, there's a large difference between the percentage of those agreements that are actually fully disclosed and published. UK is doing pretty good on that, some other countries much less so. But also for publishers. Some publishers apparently, some countries are able to negotiate that with the publishers, but the same publishers also don't allow it for some other countries. So there's definitely room, that's how I look at this slide, at more openness and also more negotiation. Not the case that some publishers do it always, allow it always, and some countries do it always. To me, this seems like it's a result of how important this is considered in negotiations. And then having the agreement available is one thing, but the next question is, of those agreements that were fully available, that were full text, that you can just open the PDF and just read what's written there, how many of those agreements actually also include the full costs that are involved? And I apologize for the dark gray here. I could not fix that in time. But what's most important is to look at the ratio of the orange here. Like, how much of those agreements, for instance, in the UK, we saw that a lot of agreements are openly available, and then only a very small percentage have the total cost publicly available. It's often available for participating institutions, but not publicly available. And here again, you see a wide variety within countries. How important, is this the case for all the agreements in a certain country? In the Netherlands, the costs are included in almost all the agreements. In other countries, it's much different. And also for publishers, there appears to be a variety. Publishers do allow it for some countries, agreements, and not for others. And if you go one step further, does the published agreement include the read and publish breakdown? Because that's often also, it varies a lot what kind of model is being used. And is there something in the agreement that explains what those costs, how they come about? And there you see that there's much less often the case that something is said about that breakdown. And I think to assess transformative agreements, I think it would be really important to have that breakdown. Because these are some of the results of those short survey questions that are also asked about transformative agreements. And there again, you can see how big that variety is. And of course, consortia negotiate these agreements, they may have different priorities. And it may well be that one model works really well for one type of country or type of institution, and another type of institution has different priorities, different things that they want to get out of an agreement. So each country or each consortia of each institution might feel that they get a good deal out of the agreement, but it's really hard to compare that across the board and really hard to say, is that indeed the case if you look to across transformative agreements? For instance, appropriate share of access-related costs, how financing has shifted, are subscription partly converted or fully converted? Is there actually a cost increase, a cost decrease? Is it cost neutral? There's a big variety on this, reported by research performing organizations. But because that information is so much lacking from those agreements, it's really hard to get a good view on that. And I think when we talk about transparency, this is one area where there would definitely be room to increase that. There's another area, and that is what are publishers actually charging for? And that is something that I briefly want to touch upon. Coalition S try to make that more transparent in their price transparency framework, where publishers are asked to break down their costs into different buckets of services, say peer review or editing, copy editing, production, all those things. And that's now available from a number of publishers for libraries if they sign into it. I think an issue with that is that the issue of price versus costs. But publishers are asked to break down the price that they ask. They're not asked to break down their costs because profit and surplus are not specified in those details. So that's one area of information that's still quite lacking. And data is also not publicly available. What I'm really curious in, I would love to hear that from people in the audience who have actually used this service, is this actually the information that's in there currently, that current breakdown? Is that useful for looking at maybe comparing publishers or going into negotiations? So if we can have a bit of a discussion about that at the end, I would really welcome that. And then, of course, I mentioned that this is all about transformative agreements. And Najko in his talk will go much more into detail about this as well. There's, of course, more than transformative agreements. There are also these other ways to finance and support open access. And getting information about that is even more difficult. It's often more ad hoc. It's often not coordinated on a national level. So agreements are entered into or support is agreed by individual research organizations, by individual funders sometimes. There are also often administrative issues because you're not licensing content that's going to be exclusive to your readers or users or authors. You're paying into services, you're paying into the public good in many cases. And so that's another thing why this is difficult and why I think more information and more sharing of knowledge on how to deal with that could be useful. And importantly, it's increasingly becoming part of open access strategies from institutions, from funders. So we can see this growing, and I think that's also why transparency around this would also be a really good thing to see growing. There's some initiative towards that. I just want to highlight that, of course, there are many ways to invest that. You can do that one-on-one by talking to publishers or by infrastructure providers. It's also, to some extent, supported, coordinated by initiatives like SCOS and Invest in Open Infrastructure. And when we talk about transparency of costs, there's a new initiative called Transparency to Sustain Open Science Infrastructure that tries to map and to make available and to collect information about how much institutions are investing in this type of infrastructure. A bit similar to OpenAPC, with the goal of making that information visible and usable. I want to briefly, at the end of this talk, show some other results from the study that are more about, okay, what's the result of all this support, financing of open access, and of course also the result of how this is being talked about, how this is being promoted within different countries. So what's the development of publishing. And for that, I looked at development of different types of open access over time. And you can have a look at development of hybrid versus full OA journals, for instance. But also look at development of non-APC gold OA, so diamond open access. What's also interesting is to look at the proportion of full open access journals that are not in the OIJ, that are often off the radar, but are in some countries quite important when you look at where people publishing. And then, of course, the importance of repository-based open access, green open access. What I didn't include here, but what's definitely relevant to look at is licenses and embargoes. That's a deeper dive into those data. I want to give you a high overview of those data, highlight some things, just to mention that these are all based on open data sources, based on Crossref, OpenAlex, DORJ, and Unpayable. And I'm very grateful that we have a proliferation of these open data sources, and it's now possible to actually do this type of study based on fully open data sources. And what this resulted in is a number of these types of graphs that to me also look a bit like when you do a geological survey and you get like a slice of the earth and you see the different layers for each country, with for each country the share of diamonds, open access articles published in a Diamond Open Access journal, articles published, the dark yellow, in a full OA journal, which is APC based. The light yellow is publishing in full open access journals that are not in the DORJ, so that we don't know of. Those can be maybe predatory journals, and that's why they're not in the DORJ. But also to a large extent, they can be expected to be Diamond Open Access journals that have not yet made it into DORJ because they don't meet some of the inclusion criteria or have not submitted to DORJ. It's really this black box almost. Then the hybrid open access, bit on bronze open access, and then the green open access, where I made a distinction between accepted published versions and also submitted versions, so preprints. This is a fictional country, so to say, or it's just one example of a country where I didn't say which it is. But when you look at how this image differs between different countries, it's quite interesting to see the differences. And I want to spend a little bit of time on that and then finish off. So in Western Europe, across the board, I think we see that the proportion of diamond open access is relatively small, quite a bit of gold open access, and we see growth in hybrid open access. That in some cases, like the Netherlands, started quite early in 2014. In some cases, like in Germany, it started considerably later, but then you see a steep increase. And you also see the difference in, for instance, for green open access, Belgium, that has historically been very strongly advocating green open access, and where you can see also that's more important in what you see, how things are made open access. Similar picture in Northern Europe, countries in Northern Europe, including the UK, where you can also often see this steep increase in hybrid open access over the years. What I found really interesting is when you include the Baltic states here, that there the picture is really different, and you see a much larger proportion of diamond open access, and in some cases also a much larger proportion of that non-DORJ full open access journals, highlighting the importance of those types of journals in those countries. And you can see that too in Eastern Europe, when you see the same, like the blue for diamond and the light green for the full open access journals, not in DORJ, where that is much more important. And similar in at least some countries in Southern Europe, with Croatia being a really exceptional exception, like really striking exception. There's a lot more that you can dive into, but I think it's really what these pictures show are potentially the influence of policies and investments, but also the importance of different open access models in different countries across Europe. I want to finish with some high-level areas of recommendations. The report has a broader list of them, but when we talk about making this information available to inform policy setting to inform investments and to also enable analysis of that, then I think one recommendation would be the availability of standardized information on open access policies, because that's really hard to cobble together. Then also transparency of publisher contracts, including that financial information, which is really like not yet standard, although you see it in a lot of cases, is by far not standard yet that's being done. Also availability of information on open access investments beyond APCs, and to be able to do those analysis that I just showed on publishing developments, also public availability of publication metadata relevant to open access. And that's also those of you who also know me from the Barcelona Declaration, which really argues for also institutions to take action to increase the availability of that information. And then finally, also more attention to transparency of costs and price of open access publishing as supplied by publishers. I would love to see more like the price transparency framework, but then as public information, because I think it will help institutions in shaping their negotiations and making choices about where to invest. And that's where I would like to leave it for today. And yeah, it's a lot of information. I hope we can have a discussion about some of this afterwards. But I'll stop now and hand over to Birgit to introduce Najko.
So thank you very much, Bianca. So a lot of food for thought from Bianca. And I'm happy to introduce Najko Jahn, my colleague working at Göttingen State and University Library. He's a data analyst and co-heads the Knowledge Commons group at our library, and he manages several projects which dig into scholarly communication, manages studies, and yeah, is a fan of open data. So we will hear from him about transformative agreements. So, Najko, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine and you see my slides now. So, as said, I want to present you the results from a study I made or I published in the beginning of this year. It's about my question there was, how open are hybrid journals and transformative agreements? So to say, I wanted to measure the uptake of open access in hybrid journals and link it to a potential impact of transformative agreements. Before starting my study, I was quite surprised to learn that that we are now discussing hybrid open access as a way to transition subscription-based publishing for more than 2 decades. So I think in 2003, this model hybrid open access was prominently introduced by Prosser in an article. And the overall idea of hybrid open access was that as the journal earned more and more revenue from open access, it could reduce its revenue from subscription, which would allow libraries and funders also to change their funding models and to shift their expenditures from subscription to open access. However, although publishers like Springer launched hybrid open access publishing opportunities, the uptake of open access in these hybrid journals has been very low due to a lack of funding opportunities. And I think this changed around 2012, 2013. Bianca already showed it in a few countries where they provided to their researchers funding opportunities for hybrid open access APCs. And at the same time, so around 2015, a white paper by the MPDL was quite critical with that approach, with the approach of individual payments for APCs like others because of the fear of so-called double dipping, so that institutions pay twice for publishing services, so for both subscriptions and open access, and they rather proposed to use the money that we are spending for subscriptions, in particular for big deals, and repurpose it for open access. And this kind of model then was family called transformative agreements, although other notions exist, like read and publish and read, but I just call it transformative agreements. And more and more countries launched together with the consortia these kind of transformative agreements in collaboration with publishers. So here, most prominently, Germany, the DEAL Consortium, which started with Wiley in mid-2019 and followed with Springer, and in 2033 with Elsevier. At the same time, also the evidence-based changed and made progress to measure actually hybrid open access. Bianca already mentioned the ESAC registry, which is a super helpful tool to actually see what kind of agreements are in place. We haven't had these kind of transparency with regard to subscription deals before. So it's it really changed the evidence base. And also we see more and more open scholarly data provider here, most prominently like Unpaywall or OpenAlex. And using these kind of data, also the evidence base progressed. However, the outcomes of these kind of transformative agreements were kind of mixed. So, for instance, the Coalition S found that many of the so-called transformative journals did not flip and also did not meet OA growth targets. Some consortia, like in Sweden, want to discontinue having transformative agreements with hybrid journal publishers. Others just renew their contracts with publishers. So giving these kind of mixed outcomes, so I asked myself, so what was the number and the proportion of open access articles and hybrid journals which are included in transformative agreements between the 5 years period 2018 till 2022. And also I wanted to know what extent did institutions with a transformative agreement contribute to open access and hybrid journals. And like Bianca, my aim was to use only open data because I wanted to also share the results and build open application on top of it. So for my research design, I combined data from multiple open data sources. On the left-hand side on this slide, you see how I collected the journal data. So I started with using the transformative agreement data as provided by the journal checker tool, which is a service from the Coalition S, enriched it with journal information in order to disaggregate journal titles, and also interlinked it with the ESAC registry for transformative agreements. So the nice thing is the journal checker tool already used this ESAC registry, so it was very straightforward to interlink these two sources. Yes, and as I was interested in just hybrid journals, and transformative agreements can also include full open access journals, I excluded those journals using the DOAJ, the Unpaywall service, and also a open access journalist from the University of Bielefeld. After obtaining the journal data, I obtained the article data, and for this I used metadata from Crossref. So I identified the published articles per journal, also used Crossref in order to determine articles under a Creative Commons license. So articles which are open access in these hybrid journals. I did another check to exclude full open access journals which are not included in the other journal sources I just mentioned, so DOAJ or Unpaywall. And then I obtained the first author country affiliations and the first author affiliations from OpenAlex in order to interlink this institutional data with institutional data as collected by the journal checker tool. So quite a journey, but let's see what the results are. So overall, I found that more than 11,000 hybrid journals published at least one open access article in the 5 years period. And overall, I investigated more than 8 million articles published in that period. And I estimated that around 750,000 articles were open access. And I was able also to attribute around half of these articles to a specific transformative agreement. So what you see here is a high-level overview. So the blue areas highlight open access, which was enabled by an agreement. The gray area shows open access, which was enabled by other means, most likely by individual payment of an IPC. And the y-axis always shows the relative or the proportion of open access in these hybrid journals. And what you see is that there's really a growth. So the proportion tripled within this 5-year period from 5% to around 15%. And in 2022, the majority of articles were facilitated through transformative agreements. I also included in that chart 2 box plots in order to show you the distribution across journals, because there's a lot of variation across the different journals. And what I find most interesting is the figure D, because it shows you that a growing number of journals were able to achieve above average proportion of open access just due open access through transformative agreements. A similar breakdown then can be also provided by publishers. And I chose to distinguish between Elsevier, Springer Nature, and Wiley and others, because in the beginning, the transformative agreements mainly targeted these big publishers because they just represent the majority of publication output. In the case of hybrid open access, so these 3 publishers represent 50% of all journals that I investigated. They published around 2/3 of all articles investigated, and they published around 75% of open access articles in my sample. And what you see really is that due to transformative agreement, the open access share grew over the years. But despite these efforts, no tipping point, if you define tipping point by like 50%, is visible. So it's Wiley, I think, achieved more than 25%, while Elsevier around 10%. So there's still a lot, there's still a gap until we can achieve this kind of tipping point. And I find it also quite interesting to learn about the different, or that in my data, the different strategies of these 3 publishers relative to transformative agreements is visible. So Elsevier, for instance, was quite reluctant when it comes to transformative agreements in the past, while Springer Nature and Wiley are much more open to agree with institutions on such agreements. Similar to the to Bianca's finding, here's a chart of the open access uptake by country. And you see the top 20 countries starting from top left, so starting with China, US, and Great Britain. And the top, they are ordered by the total number of publications by country. So not open access, but by the total number of publications. So China is, when it comes to hybrid open access publishing, or when it comes to publishing in hybrid journals, most productive, followed by the US. And you see here clearly that for the different countries that have these transformative agreements in place, they were able to, achieve high open access growth rates. So for instance, in the Netherlands or in Sweden, we have around 75 or 80%. Can we also explain why it's not 100% maybe? Because there could be also kind of, could be article caps in place, or maybe the contracts could also exclude some article types. And to better understand these kind of country trends, I also grouped the countries by the belonging to the OECD, so high income country, and to the BRICS. And in doing so, I found quite interesting opposing global trends. So you see that hybrid journals become more and more popular among researchers affiliated with institutions in the BRICS states, in particular in India and China, while in the OECD countries, the productivity is declining, especially from 2020 to 2021 to 2022. On the other hand, the number of open access articles through transformative agreements, so blue again, or other means like APCs, the dark grayish, is increasing among OECD countries. And what I also found interesting is figure B is to see that especially middle-sized countries or Western European countries and Nordic European countries like Netherlands, Finland, or Sweden really can achieve high open access rates. And what I also found interesting to see is that although there are no transformative agreements in place in China, for instance, there's still a lot of, they still have a large market share when it comes to hybrid open access published. So they have a similar market share like Netherlands. So, while submitting my preprint, I think there was also publication of this great review of the impact of transitional agreements in the UK. And they combined in-house invoicing data with open scholarly data. And they also found that transformative agreements drastically increased the proportion of open access published by the participating institutions. However, because not every because transformative agreements are not in place in every country, they also found that the hybrid journal portfolios that are included in these transformative agreements were far from being transitioned to full open access. So similar growth rates like I observed in my study. What I did not investigate in my study, but what is also an important feature of these kind of studies is, is the financial impact, or so what does it cost actually to publish open access in hybrid journals? And here's the slide figure from Haustein and colleagues, a preprint which was published a couple of weeks before, and in line with also with my work, they found that there's an increasing revenue from open access fees or from open access in general. But what I found quite interesting to see is when you contrasted it with data from the STM Association, open access is still not the dominant model. So in this STM report, for instance, it shows that most of the revenue is from non-open access business models. So there's still a lot of way to go. So when it comes to transition, in the subscription-based model to full open access. I want to conclude with this slide. So because it's about transparency and not about really the empirical results, and so some suggestions about how to improve the evidence base. I think most importantly, we need to keep in mind that the current data sources we always use to measure the progress of transformative agreement and open access transition in general are often voluntary efforts. So in particular, the ISAC registry, which is maintained by the Max Planck Digital Library, and also the Coalition S Journal Checker tool, which is often used in studies, is also a voluntary effort by the Coalition S. As a librarian, I'm a bit puzzled that these TAs do not play that prominent role in series cataloging. So maybe I suggested improvement would be to extend our series cataloging with information about transformative agreements, so that you see which institution participates in what kind of agreement and link it to journals. And also institutions should take kind of responsibility and consider data relative to hybrid open access or to the transition to open access as open research information, and support institutional efforts to collect this kind of information. Also, a huge limitation of my study is that I used authorship data in order to identify open access and to link it to transformative agreement. And we always need to keep in mind that authorship is not identical with invoicing. And in order to make use of invoicing data, I would suggest that libraries could publicly disclose article level metadata of supported articles, either directly or through means like OA workflow tools. So in Germany, for instance, the DEAR Consortium is sharing article level data of their funded or financed articles along with the progress report. So which massively increases the transparency of these agreements. But also publishers could follow some publishers' examples like that of Elsevier and provide article level invoicing metadata openly. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to answer your question and looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, thank you very much, Najko. So we are now moving into our discussion question area. So maybe let's start with Bianca. You had a question to the audience. So maybe we have a reaction on these questions.
Yeah. And just to remind people, that was about the Privacy Transparency Framework service and whether there are libraries that actually use it, and if you do, whether you find it useful and how do you use it.
So anyone, are you familiar at all with the transparency service from Plan S, and have you been using it or trying to use it? It's not an open tool, isn't it? I mean, you have to register and...
Yeah.
So I guess maybe Colleen, who was in the audience, or is in the audience. Other folks, I spot Olaf here as well, but I'm not sure if he's involved in licensing negotiations. But yeah.
I think Arya would like to say something.
Thank you.
So please do.
Yeah, we at FinLib in Finland, we do have access to the tool. It needs a little paperwork before you actually can have access, because you need to have an agreement with them. And we haven't used it a lot since there aren't that many publishers, so that limits the usefulness of the tool. But the sort of, if a lot of publishers would use it, then it would be more useful for us as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other Frank, have you tried it? He's there as well, but I'm not sure you ever checked it out. So if there's no further comments on the transparency tool, I guess that's it. I mean, in terms of not an awful lot of uptake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And,
no, that's informative as well. That's interesting in itself.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Yeah, and Colleen is also pointing to some work DeltaSync has done in terms of transparency of what publishers think in terms of where the revenue comes from. So they, of course, concentrate on the market share where there is some payment. That's definitely an interesting resource.
Yeah.
So 80% of revenues comes from subscriptions. So confirmation of what Najko was reporting from the other study, where it says it's only like 7% of the journal market value derived from paid for open access.
Yeah, maybe I can answer Colleen. So first of all, yeah, I find it a huge scandal that most of our money is still, our library money is still into subscriptions. So and yeah, what we should go for is also calling for the very same principles of transparencies that are linked to transformative agreements, also to subscription deals, and also to ask the institutions to share the information and follow the best practice of what has been achieved through these transformative agreements. So for publishers, it seems to be okay to share these kind of results and contracts. Of course, as Bianca has shown, there's still this kind of non-disclosure about the actual costs, but at least to see what kind of contracts are in place would help a lot. But maybe Inge also can help.
Yeah. So Inge, please unmute yourself if you wish to.
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yeah, hearing everything that you said on, you both said on transformative agreement, and seeing the remark how much is still under subscription, didn't the transformative agreement way actually did not at all what we wanted to achieve? So wasn't it more like a good money cow for publishers than really achieving our goals, flipping to open access? Difficult question, but based on the figures that you give and based on the data, this seems to be an important conclusion.
Definitely.
Or am I going too short?
I mean, my 2 cents on this is that publishers still exclude their cash cows, I mean, from these agreements. So they're still very reluctant from, to include their most prestigious journals where you have no doubt that the subscriptions will go on. And yeah, you bill awful lot, obviously. You get away with it. I mean, which is, yeah. So the list of which journals are included, I mean, you some of you might remember this study on Elsevier some years ago, this consultant, which digged into like the tires of what would it cost if there would be a flip in terms of, the prices, average prices per article. You likely have these journals simply not included in the transformative agreements because these figures are more in this middle range and not in the like high-end price per journal article. So, but Bianca, you also wanted to comment, I guess.
Yeah, maybe just to add in, and I fully agree. I think there are 2 things there. First of all, what would we count as success? Would we count as success if indeed that flip would be there and those journals in the transformative agreements would all flip to open access? But even then, suppose that's true, then would that be a success? Or would we then just have succeeded in just supporting a one size fits all, one open access model at the detriment to a lot of other options that might be more equitable in terms of cost and affordability?
I agree. Can I ask another question? Well, actually, it's more of a pretty question. So we turning to Diamond Open Access and open infrastructures for scholarly communication, scholarly publishing. We see that we have a problem in finding what the cost is, what the investments are for these kind of infrastructure. And I must say I struggle a bit to calculate that in our institution. And I know there is a DIAMAS project, but I don't remember if that is part of the DIAMAS project. So should we have like some kind of checklist or a best practice on how to calculate? What do we take into account? What do we not? For example, do we include the costs for a clocks archive in such when you try to figure out the costs? There's a lot of freelance investment of resources within the communities that use these services. So I don't remember if it's part of the DIAMAS, maybe it is. But such a checklist might help us to achieve that. But then again, it will be on voluntary basis again. So, but it's a start maybe.
Yeah, there might be a cost calculation model in DIAMAS indeed, but I'm not so sure.
I'm not sure, just briefly, because I've been part of DIAMAS, but not everything. There is attention to at least ways of supporting that, and then also that question of then, like, yeah, what's reasonable support and what are costs made? I don't think there's a cost model. There are several studies. We did this in our Diamond Journal study. We did do some estimation. I think it would be really good as part of this whole discussion about Diamond to actually have that transparency, both with the publishers or the service providers, but also with institutions. What do they support and through which ways? And have that discussion.
Yeah, we try to do it in the context of the yearly EOSC survey and to try to calculate, because yeah, it's part of open science efforts, and we always hit on this wall, like what do we include and what do we not include, and what is fair to include and what not.
So Inga, as you are here, I mean, who is the target of this EOSC survey? I mean, where's the data collected from for the countries?
The countries, there is always one person that is contacted for the countries. There's one contact person through the steering group. So there is this steering group for EOSC where you have the member states, EOSC Association, and the European Commission. And the representatives of the countries in that steering group, there are the person the EOSC survey is sent to. But it is really shaped, this EOSC survey, that you can delegate questions to certain persons. So you can fill it out normally with different persons. But this means that, of course, the person in the steering group needs to...
so in the steering group, it's typically someone from the like ministry or something, and then they can delegate. Yeah. So it's not like, you know, the other survey in the EOSC association where you like ask, what are you investing into EOSC from the data infrastructure perspective? So there's never like this match between what institutions are investing and what the country representative thinks they are investing. So
well, yeah. So, but these things are converging. But there is the country survey, and then you have the survey of the EOSC association members.
That's
But of course, there are quite some countries with almost no EOSC association members, and there are others with a lot of members. But this being said, this is more or less that is the one that is used in the EOSC Observatory. That is where the country provides information.
So we have a couple more comments in the chat, but I just noticed we have already reached the end of the hour. So I'm sure we could have continued our discussion. So I would say thank you all. Thank you again to the speakers, to our support, Ilkay and Barbara. Thank you for making this happen. And yeah, so slides will be shared. I guess everyone who has registered will be alerted by the LIBER office that recordings and slides are available. So stay tuned, and keep watching the space. There will certainly be more webinars coming from LIBER on different topics. And yeah, try to implement what Bianca and Najko suggested. So please share your information. I mean, the hope is, of course, more on the institutions than on the publishers. But if you can do anything on this front, please request this information and try to share it wherever you can. And through the instruments which have been mentioned, like OpenAPC or the survey or the volunteer databases. So thank you all, and have a rest of nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.